While the present danger was that Don Army Group would be bottled up on the Sea of Azov, and Army Group A consequently lost in the Kuban, we could safely assume that even if this could be avoided and the whole Donets area held, the enemy's later aim would be to encircle the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front on the Black Sea. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Command felt able to seek a solution by renewed offensive action in 1943, it could again only do so on the southern wing, but on no account from out of the Don Donets salient because of the now familiar supply difficulties and the flanking threat to which any attack from this balcony projection would be exposed from the outset. The only means of achieving an offensive solution, always assuming that this were in the least feasible, consisted in the first place in drawing the enemy westwards towards the lower Dnieper on our southern wing. Having once achieved this, we had to launch a powerful attack from the Kharkov area and smash the Russian front connecting there in order to turn south and surround the enemy on the Sea of Azov. Hitler, however, was apparently unwilling to entertain any ideas of this kind. He had already been told by Zeitzler himself, so the latter informed me, that the only question now was whether to abandon the Donets area by itself or to lose Don Army Group along with it. Hitler's answer had been that although his chief of staff was probably right from the operational point of view, the surrender of the Donets area was impossible for economic reasons, not so much because of any loss of coal to ourselves, as because a German withdrawal would put the enemy back in possession of the supplies so vital to his own steel production. As an interim solution, Hitler had directed that the SS Reich Division, the first of the SS Panzer Corps formations to have reached Kharkov, should launch a thrust from that area into the rear of the enemy forces advancing against our Donets front. Quite apart from the fact that this solitary division could never suffice for such a far-ranging operation, it would have had to overrun 6 enemy divisions for a start, and that there would be nothing available to cover its ever-lengthening northern flank, its commitment to battle would have meant splitting up the only striking force, the SS Panzer Corps, which could be expected to join us in the foreseeable future. If it came to that, the Reich Division was no longer free for such an operation, Army Group B having already had to throw it in to meet the rapid advance of the Soviets towards Kharkov. At that very hour it was tied up in a pretty unpromising defensive action at Volchansk, northeast of the city. During the next couple of days, 4th and 5th February, the situation on Don Army Group's front deteriorated visibly, the enemy bringing sharp pressure to bear on 4th Panzer Army as it covered the flow of 1st Panzer Army through Rostov. 2 armies from his former Caucasus front, 44th and 58th, had now joined the 3 already facing 4th Panzer Army, a sure sign that the threat which Army Group A's 17th Army in the Kuban was supposed to constitute in the flank of the Russians had not deterred them from transferring substantial forces to the decisive battleground. Before long, Don Army Group would have to expect a massed attack on both Rostov itself and the Don front, each side of Novocherkassk. In addition, a strong motorized force was found to be moving from Stalingrad towards the Don. On the Army Group's left wing, too, the situation was becoming increasingly grave. East of Voroshilovgrad, 6th Panzer Division, which Army Detachment Hollit had rushed up to the Middle Donets in pursuance of the Army Group order of 14th of January, had not succeeded in flinging the enemy back across the river. All it could do for the time being was to bottle him up in the bridgehead he had gained there. Further west, the enemy had been able to cross the Donets on a broad front, there being practically no forces whatever to defend it. He was now outside Slavyansk and had taken Izium. Even now, therefore, it appeared doubtful whether the withdrawal of Army Detachment Hollit into the Mius positions would still be at all feasible. The Army Group had intended to have it on the Novocherkassk-Kamensk line by 5th of January, but in fact it had been tied down on the Don and Donets through Hitler's refusal to let us take the front back to the Mius. If the enemy were to push swiftly southeastwards from Slavyansk, he would unhinge the Mius defences from the start. Even though HQ 1st Panzer Army and the forces we had allocated to it were by this time on the road from Rostov to the Middle Donets, it would inevitably be several days yet before the army could take an effective hand there. What made things worse was that the saturated roads in the coastal area greatly hampered the progress of the armoured divisions, whereas the ground further north was still frozen solid and in no way affected the Russians' mobility. In view of these ominous developments, the army group not only renewed its call for an immediate withdrawal of its right wing to the Meuse, but also presented OKH with a series of specific demands which were intended to underline the perilousness of the situation. It called for the concentration of 7 AA Division, which was engaged on anti-aircraft defence in the communications zone, to provide both air and ground protection for the supply route running through Dnipropetrovsk. It called for the immediate preparation of an airlift in case the enemy were to cut its rear communications. It called for a ruthless increase in the transport capacity of the railway at the expense of supplies to Army Group B, which had hardly any more troops to feed anyway. It demanded that unless the promised attack by the SS Reich Division had achieved complete success, which must mean reaching Kupiansk, by 6th of February, the SS Panzer Corps should attack south of the Donets towards Isium as soon as the increase in troop trains enabled it to assemble around Kharkov. Finally, the Army Group called for the immediate transfer of the combat troops of 13 Panzer Division and 2 infantry divisions of 17th Army to the lower Dnieper, where they would be furnished with new weapons and take over the B-echelon transport and supply columns of 6th Army located there. Even if Hitler shut his eyes to our more long-term view of operations, these demands would in any case bring the urgency of the position home to him. And sure enough, as a result of this teleprinter message, a Condor aircraft touched down on our airstrip on 6th of February to fetch me to General Headquarters for an interview with Hitler. His decision to give me a personal hearing may have been partially due to a visit paid to us at the end of January by his senior military assistant Schmundt, to whom we had expressed our views very forcibly on the present situation and the way in which things were being handled at the top. While the present danger was that Don Army Group would be bottled up on the Sea of Azov, and Army Group A consequently lost in the Kuban, we could safely assume that even if this could be avoided and the whole Donetsk area held, the enemy's later aim would be to encircle the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front on the Black Sea. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Command felt able to seek a solution by renewed offensive action in 1943, it could again only do so on the southern wing, but on no account from out of the Don-Donetsk salient because of the now familiar supply difficulties and the flanking threat to which any attack from this balcony projection would be exposed from the outset. The only means of achieving an offensive solution, always assuming that this were in the least feasible, consisted in the first place in drawing the enemy westwards towards the lower Dnieper on our southern wing. Having once achieved this, we had to launch a powerful attack from the Kharkov area and smash the Russian front connecting there in order to turn south and surround the enemy on the Sea of Azov. Hitler, however, was apparently unwilling to entertain any ideas of this kind. He had already been told by Seitzler himself, so the latter informed me, that the only question now was whether to abandon the Donetsk area by itself or to lose Don Army Group along with it. Hitler's answer had been that although his chief of staff was probably right from the operational point of view, the surrender of the Donetsk area was impossible for economic reasons, not so much because of any loss of coal to ourselves, as because a German withdrawal would put the enemy back in possession of the supplies so vital to his own steel production. As an interim solution, Hitler had directed that the SS Reich Division, the first of the SS Panzer Corps formations to have reached Kharkov, should launch a thrust from that area into the rear of the enemy forces advancing against our Donetsk front. Quite apart from the fact that this solitary division could never suffice for such a far-ranging operation, it would have had to overrun 6 enemy divisions for a start, and that there would be nothing available to cover its ever-lengthening northern flank. Its commitment to battle would have meant splitting up the only striking force, the SS Panzer Corps, which could be expected to join us in the foreseeable future. If it came to that, the Reich Division was no longer free for such an operation, Army Group B having already had to throw it in to meet the rapid advance of the Soviets towards Kharkov. At that very hour, it was tied up in a pretty unpromising defensive action at Volchansk, northeast of the city. During the next couple of days, 4th and 5th February, the situation on Don Army Group's front deteriorated visibly, the enemy bringing sharp pressure to bear on 4th Panzer Army as it covered the flow of 1st Panzer Army through Rostov. Two armies from his former Caucasus front, 44th and 58th, had now joined the three already facing 4th Panzer Army, a sure sign that the threat which Army Group A's 17th Army in the Kuban was supposed to constitute in the flank of the Russians had not deterred them from transferring substantial forces to the decisive battleground. Before long, Don Army Group would have to expect a massed attack on both Rostov itself and the Don front each side of Novocherkassk. In addition, a strong motorized force was found to be moving from Stalingrad towards the Don. On the Army Group's left wing, too, the situation was becoming increasingly grave. East of Voroshilovgrad, 6th Panzer Division, which Army Detachment Hollet had rushed up to the Middle Donets in pursuance of the Army Group order of 14th of January, had not succeeded in flinging the enemy back across the river. All it could do for the time being was to bottle him up in the bridgehead he had gained there. Further west, the enemy had been able to cross the Donets on a broad front, there being practically no forces whatever to defend it. He was now outside Slaviansk and had taken Isium. Even now, therefore, it appeared doubtful whether the withdrawal of Army Detachment Hollet into the Mius positions would still be at all feasible. The Army Group had intended to have it on the Novocherkassk-Kamensk line by 5th of January, but in fact it had been tied down on the Don and Donets through Hitler's refusal to let us take the front back to the Mius. If the enemy were to push swiftly southeastwards from Slaviansk, he would unhinge the Mius defences from the start. Even though HQ 1st Panzer Army and the forces we had allocated to it were by this time on the road from Rostov to the Middle Donets, it would inevitably be several days yet before the army could take an effective hand there. What made things worse was that the saturated roads in the coastal area greatly hampered the progress of the armoured divisions, whereas the ground further north was still frozen solid and in no way affected the Russians' mobility. In view of these ominous developments, the Army Group not only renewed its call for an immediate withdrawal of its right wing to the Mius, but also presented OKH with a series of specific demands which were intended to underline the perilousness of the situation. It called for the concentration of 7th LA Division, which was engaged on anti-aircraft defence in the communications zone, to provide both air and ground protection for the supply route running through Dnepropetrovsk. It called for the immediate preparation of an airlift in case the enemy were to cut its rear communications. It called for a ruthless increase in the transport capacity of the railway at the expense of supplies to Army Group B, which had hardly any more troops to feed anyway. It demanded that unless the promised attack by the SS Reich Division had achieved complete success, which must mean reaching Kupiansk, by 6th of February, the SS Panzer Corps should attack south of the Donets towards Isium as soon as the increase in troop trains enabled it to assemble around Kharkov. Finally, the Army Group called for the immediate transfer of the combat troops of 13 Panzer Division and 2 infantry divisions of 17th Army to the lower Dnieper, where they would be furnished with new weapons and take over the B-echelon transport and supply columns of 6th Army located there. Even if Hitler shut his eyes to our more long-term view of operations, these demands would in any case bring the urgency of the position home to him. And sure enough, as a result of this teleprinter message, a Condor aircraft touched down on our airstrip on 6th February to fetch me to General Headquarters for an interview with Hitler. His decision to give me a personal hearing may have been partially due to a visit paid to us at the end of January by his senior military assistant Schmundt, to whom we had expressed our views very forcibly on the present situation and the way in which things were being handled at the top. The conference of 6th of February 1943 between Hitler and myself made it possible to forestall the disaster threatening to overtake the German southern wing and to give the Supreme Command one more chance at least to obtain a stalemate in the east. Hitler opened the talks, as I have already reported in the chapter on Stalingrad, with an unqualified admission of his exclusive responsibility for the fate of Sixth Army, which had met its tragic end a few days previously. At the time, I had the impression that he was deeply affected by this tragedy, not just because it amounted to a blatant failure of his own leadership, but also because he was deeply depressed in a purely personal sense by the fate of the soldiers who, out of faith in him, had fought to the last with such courage and devotion to duty. Yet later on I came to doubt whether Hitler had any place whatever in his heart for the soldiers who put such boundless trust in him and remained true to him till the end. By then I wondered if he did not regard all of them, from field marshal down to private soldier, as mere tools of his war aims. Be that as it may, this gesture of Hitler's in assuming immediate and unqualified responsibility for Stalingrad struck a chivalrous note. Whether deliberately or unconsciously, he had thus shown considerable psychological skill in the way he opened our discussion. He always did have a masterly knack of adapting his manner to his interlocutor. For my own part, I had made up my mind to discuss two questions with him. The first was that of the future conduct of operations in my own area, which depended on getting Hitler's consent to the abandonment of the eastern part of the Donets Basin. It was essential to elicit this from him that very day. The second question I wished to bring up was that of the Supreme Command, i.e. the form in which it had been exercised by Hitler ever since the dismissal of Field Marshal Brauchitsch. The outcome of this style of leadership, Stalingrad, gave me adequate reason for raising it. To dispose of the second question first, let me say quite briefly that no satisfactory conclusion was reached. Realizing that a dictator like Hitler would never bring himself to resign as Commander-in-Chief, I tried to get him to accept a solution which would not damage his prestige and yet guarantee a salutary military leadership for the future. I asked him to ensure the uniformity of this leadership by appointing one Chief of Staff whom he must trust implicitly, and at the same time vest with the appropriate responsibility and authority. But Hitler was clearly not willing to treat the matter impartially. He kept resorting to the personal aspects of the case, complaining of the disappointments he had suffered with Verse Blomberg, the war minister, and even with Brauchitsch. He quite bluntly declared, moreover, that he could not possibly put anyone in a position that would virtually set him above Göring, who would never subordinate himself to the guidance of a chief of staff, even if the latter were acting in Hitler's name. Whether Hitler was really reluctant to offend Göring, or merely used this as a pretext, I cannot say. This brings us back to the first question, that of the future of operations in the area of Don Army Group. I began by giving Hitler a picture of the Army Group's present situation and went on to list the conclusions to be drawn from it. I pointed out that our forces would on no account suffice to hold the area of the Don and Donets. However highly Hitler cared to rate its value to either side, the only real question was whether, in trying to hang on to the whole of the Donets Basin, we wanted to lose the latter plus Don Army Group, and in due course Army Group A as well, or whether, by abandoning part of it at the right moment, we could avert the catastrophe that threatened to overtake us. Passing on from these manifest aspects of the present situation, I endeavoured to make Hitler see what would inevitably happen later if we persisted in remaining in the Don Donets balcony. The enemy would be free, now that Army Group B was almost completely out of action, to turn the strong forces advancing through the latter's area down towards the lower Dnieper or the coast, and thus to cut off the entire southern wing. What happened down on this southern wing, I emphasized, would decide the outcome of the whole war in the east. It was certain that the enemy would continue to draw on his still strong reserves, particularly from around Stalingrad, to ensure that his struggle to slice off the German army's southern wing fully achieved its object. For this reason, no counter-thrust by the SS Panzer Corps could be considered adequate to intercept the wide outflanking movement which the enemy would make. He would be quite powerful enough to carry out this envelopment and screen it off to the west around Kharkov simultaneously. Even the sum total of possible German reinforcements would still not be enough to stop this enemy thrust. It was absolutely essential, therefore, that 1st Panzer Army, now on its way to the Middle Donets, should be immediately followed by 4th Panzer Army to intercept the still not acute but nonetheless inevitable threat of an enemy envelopment between the Donets and Dnieper. Only then would it be possible, in cooperation with the approaching reinforcements, to restore the situation on the German southern wing of the Eastern Front, i.e. the entire stretch of front from the coast of the Sea of Azov to the right wing of Central Army Group. Unless 4th Panzer Army were pulled back from the Lower Don, this would not be possible. Yet to take it away from there automatically implied withdrawing from the Don Donets salient into the Mayos positions along its base. There was not a day to lose over this. Indeed, it was already doubtful, thanks to the delay in taking a decision, whether Army Detachment Hollit, now saddled with the defence of the whole front from the coastline to the Middle Donets, would ever get back to the Mius in time. Consequently, I had to receive permission that very day to give up the eastern part of the Donets area as far as the Mius. This statement of mine, to which, incidentally, Hitler listened with the utmost composure, was followed by a dispute on the Donets Basin issue lasting several hours. Even during the second part of our talks, when I discussed the whole problem of leadership with him in private, Hitler kept coming back to it. As was to be my experience on similar occasions, he avoided any real discussion of what I had to say on operational matters. He did not even try to propound a better plan of his own or to refute the assumptions on which I had based my arguments. Nor did he dispute that the situation would develop in the way I felt bound to anticipate. He treated every statement not bearing directly on the most pressing needs of the moment as sheer hypothesis which might or might not become reality. Now, all considerations of an operational nature are ultimately based, especially when one has lost the initiative to the enemy, on appreciations or hypotheses regarding the course of action which the enemy may be expected to take. While no one can prove beforehand that a situation will develop in such and such a way, the only successful military commander is the one who can think ahead. He must be able to see through the veil in which the enemy's future actions are always wrapped, at least to the extent of correctly judging the possibilities open to both the enemy and himself. The greater one's sphere of command, of course, the further ahead one must think, and the greater the distances to be covered and the formations to be moved, the longer is the interval that must elapse before the decision one has taken can produce tangible results. This long-term thinking was not to Hitler's taste, however, at least not in the operational field. Possibly he disliked the prospect of being confronted with conclusions which did not conform to his wishes. Since these could not be refuted, he avoided becoming involved in them wherever possible, and so this time, too, he mainly drew his arguments from other fields. He began by dwelling on his understandable aversion to any voluntary surrender of hard-won territory, so long as it could not be proved, as he thought, that no alternative method existed. It was a viewpoint which every soldier will appreciate. In my own case, particularly, it went right against the grain on this and so many later occasions, to have to goad Hitler into giving territory up. I should have much preferred to be able to submit plans for successful offensives instead of for the now inevitable withdrawals. But it is a well-known maxim of war that whoever tries to hold on to everything at once finishes up by holding nothing at all. Another argument which Hitler kept advancing was that any shortening of the front such as I had proposed for the purpose of making additional forces available would release an equivalent proportion of enemy forces which could then be thrown into the scale at a crucial spot. This in itself was also quite a tenable argument. The constantly decisive factor in any such shift of forces, however, is which of the two opponents gains the lead. In other words, which of them is offered the opportunity, by his own timely action, to seize the initiative at the crucial spot and thereafter to dictate his own terms to the more slow-moving enemy, even when the latter is collectively the stronger. In the case of any attempt to hold the Don Donets salient, moreover, the excessive length of the fronts virtually cancelled out the superiority in strength usually enjoyed by a defender over his attacker. In conditions of this kind, the attacker has a chance to pierce the overextended front at a spot of his own choosing, using relatively small forces and suffering no great losses. Since the defence lacks reserves, he is able to demolish the whole structure. Hitler also argued that if one fought bitterly for every foot of ground and made the enemy pay dearly for every step he advanced, even the Soviet army's offensive power must one day be exhausted. The enemy had now been attacking for 2.5 months without a break. His losses were high, and he must soon be at the end of his tether. As he drew further away from his starting lines, moreover, his supply difficulties would halt any far-flung outflanking movement he might be planning. There was certainly a great deal of truth in all that Hitler said. Undoubtedly, the enemy had had very big losses, at least when attacking sectors held by the Germans, and these would have made large inroads on his offensive power. Yet he had had correspondingly easy successes in sectors where there was not the stubborn resistance of German troops to contend with. It was also true that the losses of the Soviet troops, the infantry first and foremost, had greatly lowered their quality. Otherwise we could not have held our own against such odds. But however much the enemy division's losses might reduce their combat efficiency, there were always new ones to take their place. As for Soviet supply difficulties, these could indeed be expected to increase the further the enemy's operations took him. But in this age of motor transport, the distances from the army's railheads to the Sea of Azov or the lower Dnieper were not big enough to frustrate the impending Soviet drive to lop off the German southern wing. During World War I, it had still been accepted that no army could normally put more than 95 miles between itself and its railhead. That this figure no longer held good in World War II had been adequately proved by our own operations in both East and West. In addition, the Russians were masters at the rapid reconstruction of railways, which presented relatively few engineering problems on those vast expanses of plain. In any case, it was entirely wrong to base our own measures on the vague hope that the enemy would soon reach the limit of his strength or mobility. When all was said and done, our own divisions, long overtaxed and severely bled, were themselves not far from exhaustion. In this respect, I must emphasize that Hitler was fully aware of the condition and casualties of our own troops. What he did not care to admit was that the newly established divisions initially had to pay far too high a toll in blood on account of their lack of combat experience. On the other hand, he did agree that the Luftwaffe field divisions had proved a fiasco, and even confessed that they had been brought into existence as a concession to Goering's thirst for prestige. All Hitler actually had to say about the operational position was to express the belief that the SS Panzer Corps would be able to remove the acute threat to the Middle Donetsk front by a southeasterly thrust from the Kharkov region in the direction of Isium. His one reservation was that by the time the Corps' 2nd Division, the Leibstandarte, arrived, the Reich Division should have dealt with the enemy at Volchansk. A 3rd Division could not come until later. His faith in the penetrating power of this newly established SS Panzer Corps was apparently unbounded. Otherwise, however, his statements showed that he still did not, or would not, realize the dangers of the less immediate future, especially when the enemy's Stalingrad formations appeared on the new battlefield. But the most decisive argument repeatedly put forward by Hitler was the present impossibility, as he saw it, of giving up the Donetsk area. He feared the repercussions on Turkey, for one thing. Most of all, he stressed the importance of the Donetsk coal to our own war economy, and the effect on the enemy of continuing to be deprived of it. Only by regaining this coal, he said, would the Russians be able to maintain their steel production and thereby keep up their output of tanks, guns, and ammunition. When reminded that they had turned out plenty of tanks and ammunition to date despite having lost the Donetsk basin, Hitler replied that they were simply living off their existing stocks of steel. If they did not get the coal fields back, he insisted, they could not keep up their previous production, which in turn would prevent them from mounting any more big offensives. Now no one would deny that the enemy must be having production trouble in consequence of the loss of the coking coal and the steel and other plant of the Donetsk basin. One proof, in my own opinion, was the fact that he had so far not succeeded in replacing the mass of the artillery he had lost in 1941. It was this which had enabled us to defend the patchwork Cheer front earlier on. That winter, he did in fact have enough guns to commit an overwhelming concentration of them on limited sectors of front, as, for example, during the 3 successive breakthroughs on the Don, but he obviously still had not enough to equip all his divisions with fully mobile artillery. This discussion on the economic importance of the Donetsk area, by the way, gave Hitler an opportunity to display his quite astonishing knowledge of production figures and weapon potentials. In this conflict of views on the advisability or otherwise of trying to hold on to the Donetsk basin, I was ultimately left with only one trump card in my hand. Shortly before my flight to Lützen, we had a visit at my headquarters from Paul Pleiger, president of the Reichsvereinigung Kohle, the German coal cartel. When questioned on the real importance of the Donetsk area to the German and Russian war economies, he had assured me that the mines around Shakhty, i.e. in that part of the basin which lay east of the Meuse, were in no way vital, as the coal there was unsuitable for coking or locomotive combustion. This disposed of Hitler's objections from the standpoint of economic warfare. But anyone who supposes that he would now admit his defeat is underestimating the man's pertinacity. As a means at least of delaying the evacuation of the Don Donetsk salient, he finally resorted to the weather. As luck would have it, an unusually early thaw had set in during the last few days. The road across the ice of Taganrog Bay could no longer be used with complete safety, and although the Don and Donetsk were still frozen over, it was always possible that the ice would soon start breaking up if the milder weather continued. Hitler now used all the eloquence at his command to persuade me that in only a few days' time the broad valley of the Don might well be an impassable obstacle over which the enemy could not possibly attack before summer. Conversely, our own 4th Panzer Army would get bogged down in the mud if it moved west. The least I could do in the circumstances, he said, was to wait for a short while longer. When I still would not budge and refused to stake the fate of my army group on the hope of a quite unseasonable change of weather, Hitler finally agreed to the withdrawal of the army group's eastern front to the Meuse. If one included the discussion on the command problem, we had been in conference for 4 whole hours. The extent of Hitler's perseverance is shown by a small thing which happened just after I had taken leave of him. Having given what amounted to final approval of my operational intentions, he called me back again as I was about to leave his room. He said that while he naturally had no wish to alter a decision once it had been agreed upon, he would still urge me to consider just once more whether I could not wait for at least a little longer. A thaw in the Don basin might even yet enable us to remain in the Don Donetsk salient. I still stood firm, however. All I would promise him was not to issue the withdrawal order until I reached my headquarters at noon next day, provided the situation report sent up that evening did not necessitate immediate action. I have given all this space to my interview with Hitler, not only on account of the decisive effect it had on the outcome of the campaign that winter, but also because I find it in many respects typical of his attitude and of the difficulty of getting him to accept anything which did not conform to his own wishes. It would be wrong to suppose, just because we had succeeded, after a long tussle, in obtaining Hitler's agreement to the evacuation of the east of the Donetsk basin, which in turn enabled us to throw 4th Panzer Army over to our western wing, that the menace to the German southern wing as a whole was already eliminated. The process of leapfrogging 4th Panzer Army from east to west was bound to take about 2 weeks, in view of the distance involved and the state of the roads. Furthermore, it was by no means certain whether Army Detachment Hollet would reach the Meuse positions safely, considering that the enemy in its deep flank around Voroshilovgrad was already south of the Donets. It was still uncertain, moreover, whether 1st Panzer Army could hold or restore to any reasonable extent the front on the Middle Donets. Above all, the situation in the area of Army Group B, i.e. in the region of Kharkov, was shaping so ominously that all sorts of opportunities were opening up to the enemy. Not only could he drive through to the Dnieper crossings at Dnepropetrovsk and Zaporozhye and cut off Don Army Group's communications there, it was even possible for him to cross the river further upstream and block it from the west. Besides shifting 4th Panzer Army over to the western wing of the Army Group, therefore, it would be necessary to form a new grouping of forces to replace Army Group B's Allied armies, which had by now gone almost completely to pieces. At noon on 7th February, I arrived back at my headquarters at Stalin. The situation on the Don had been aggravated by the capture of Bateysk, a suburb of Rostov on the south bank of the river. Immediately upon my return, the Army Group gave orders to fall back behind the Don and began moving HQ 4th Panzer Army, together with whatever divisions it could make available, over to the western wing. Army Detachment Holit received instructions to retire to the line Novocherkassk, Kamensk in the first instance. On 8th of February, further emergencies arose at Rostov and Voroshilovgrad, where the enemy broke out of the bridgehead he had gained earlier on. The position of 1st Panzer Army, now involved in the fighting on the Middle Donets, was just as critical inasmuch as the success we had hoped it would score against the enemy advancing across the stretch of river between Lysychansk and Slavyansk had so far not materialized. Around Kharkov, in the area of Army Group B, a new army detachment was just being formed under General Lanz. The SS Panzer Corps, which was still in the process of arriving, had been placed under its command. We learnt that the SS Reich Division, which was to have smashed the enemy at Volchansk preparatory to thrusting southeast towards Isium, had in fact come nowhere near doing so. On the contrary, it had retired behind the Donets. In the circumstances, it was certain that nothing would come of the thrust which Hitler had proposed making with the SS Panzer Corps, of which the Reich Division was the only formation so far available, to relieve the pressure on our western flank. On 9th of February, the enemy had taken Belgorod and Kursk in Army Group B's area north of Kharkov. He was also advancing west from the Donets Bend around Isium. In the gap between the Dnieper and the right wing of Central Army Group, which only began some considerable distance north of Kursk, there was practically nothing but Army Detachment Lanz, whose assembly at Kharkov was already imperilled, and Army Group B's badly battered Second Army west of Kursk. In view of the fact that the enemy could now carry out a wide outflanking movement across the Dnieper upstream from Dnipropetrovsk, it was clear that despite the steps taken to shift 4th Panzer Army to the western wing, Don Army Group would in the long run be unable to guarantee the security of its rear communications with its own forces alone. Something radical had to be done. I accordingly sent General Zeitzler a teleprinter message calling for the deployment within the next fortnight of a new army of at least 5 or 6 divisions in the area north of Dnipropetrovsk, as well as of another army behind Second Army's front, i.e. west of Kursk, for a thrust to the south. To do this, I said, there must be a basic improvement in the efficiency of transport, as the slow trickle of divisions which had been coming through to date could not possibly help matters in the present situation. General Zeitzler did hold out the prospect of really effective assistance from now on. He hoped that he could at last release 6 more divisions from Central and Northern Army groups and get these to us faster than had been the case hitherto. The daily number of trains he envisaged was 37, which meant that we could count on having one of the 6 promised divisions every other day. In view of the breadth of the gap torn in the German front, of course, even these forces would be no more than a stopgap to tide us over the worst dangers until the muddy season set in, and whether they would arrive in time depended on developments around Kharkov, on which our own army group had no influence. In any case, the German southern wing remained overshadowed by the mortal danger that either before or immediately after the muddy season the enemy would push through to the Sea of Azov, or, by striking even further west, to the Black Sea. While the Army Group's deep flank thus constituted its main source of anxiety, the trend of events on its own fronts was also far from encouraging. 1st Panzer Army, Commander General Versa Mackensen, Chief of Staff Colonel Wenck, the task of which was to throw the enemy who had crossed the Middle Donets back across the river, had to contend with 2 superior enemy forces. The first, which had come over the Donets at Voroshilovgrad, was trying to drive in between Army Detachment Holit as it fell back on the Mius and 1st Panzer Army as it moved up to the Donets from the south. The other was the force which had crossed the Donets along the Lysychansk-Slavyansk line and was now striving to shift its main effort to its western wing on both sides of the Krivoy Torets. 1st Panzer Army, which was liable to be enveloped from both flanks, had to try to tackle the two groups of enemy successively. The army group's own view was that it should deliver the first punch on its western wing and dispatch the enemy at Slavyansk before turning on the force at Voroshilovgrad. Unfortunately, the army had initially been compelled to tie up part of its forces with the latter group, with the result that it was no longer strong enough to beat the enemy at Slavyansk. This in turn meant that there could not be enough forces south of Voroshilovgrad to block the enemy's thrust to the southwest. As is so often the case in times of crisis, the large-scale emergencies were intensified by irritations of a localized character. On the basis of reconnaissance carried out before it dispatched 40 Panzer Corps to destroy the enemy force advancing from Slavyansk, 1st Panzer Army had decided that it was impossible for tanks to outflank the enemy over the ground west of the Krivoy Torets, because the deep fissures crisscrossing this particular stretch of country were buried in snow. Consequently, 40 Panzer Corps put in its attack more or less frontally, along and eastwards of the river valley. As the intense cold of the Russian winter makes it virtually impossible for troops to remain in the open country at night, most of the fighting inevitably took place around the inhabited localities in the Krivoy Torets valley, the first main objective being possession of the big factory town of Kramatorskaya. In a battle of this kind, however, there was no hope of gaining the quick decision we so urgently needed against the enemy force at Slavyansk, and 11 Panzer Division, which was leading the attack, progressed only with great difficulty. While the army group's intention of cutting the enemy off from the Donets by enveloping him from the west had thus been rendered nugatory, the latter pushed a strong force of armour through the allegedly impassable country west of the Krivoy Torets on the night of 11th of February, penetrating as far as Grishino. Once again it was seen that the Western conception of impassability had only limited validity where the Russians are concerned, partly, of course, because the wider tracks of Soviet armoured vehicles made it considerably easier for them to negotiate the mud or deep snow which held up our own tanks. At Grishino, the enemy was now not only deep in the flank of 1st Panzer Army, but also blocking the army group's main railway line from Dnepropetrovsk to Krasnoarmeyskoye. Only the railway through Zaporozhye remained open, and even in this case efficiency was reduced by the fact that the big Dnieper bridge destroyed by the enemy in 1941 was still not open to traffic. As a result, all goods had to be reloaded, and tank wagons carrying petrol could not go through to the front. While supplies to the battlefront, especially petrol, were thus endangered, and 1st Panzer Army was faced with the threat of being outflanked from the west, the enemy simultaneously tried to turn its flank from the east with the forces which had broken through by way of Voroshilovgrad. In particular, one enemy cavalry corps had managed to penetrate as far as the important rail junction of Debaltsevo, which lay not only far to the rear of the army's right wing, but even behind the position due to be occupied by Army Detachment Holit on the Mius. Although it was possible to surround this corps at Debaltsevo, its destruction proved a difficult and lengthy business on account of the tough resistance it put up in the villages. As a result, 17 Panzer Division, which was urgently required on the army's western wing, remained tied down here for the time being. On the eastern front, Soviet armoured forces, just back from a rest and refit, pressed hard behind Army Detachment Holit as it fell back on the Mius. As a result, we were temporarily unable to pull out the armoured divisions still with the army detachment. The army detachment did nonetheless succeed in reaching the Mius positions on 17th February and in organising a defence there. On the western wing, it had meanwhile proved possible to halt the enemy armour at Grishino by throwing in the Viking division as it arrived from the Don. The latter was unable to dispose of the enemy with any speed, however. Apart from having been considerably weakened in the recent heavy fighting, it was suffering from an acute shortage of officers. The division was composed of SS volunteers from the Baltic and Nordic countries, and its losses had been so severe that there were no longer enough officers available with a command of the appropriate languages. Naturally enough, this had an adverse effect on the fighting efficiency of what was intrinsically a useful body of troops. In the meantime, 4th Panzer Army was still moving by road and rail from the Lower Don to the Western Wing, its progress being considerably delayed by the bad state of the roads. Thus, apart from the fact that the enemy was already in 1st Panzer Army's deep flank at Gryshino and able to send in fresh forces to reinforce those temporarily held up there, the danger in the yawning gap between the left wing of 1st Panzer Army and the Kharkov region remained as desperate as ever. In this area, the enemy had complete freedom of action. These critical developments in the Army Group's own area were primarily the result of the excessive length of time it had had to leave its forces forward on the Don and Donets to cover the withdrawal of Army Group A. Henceforth, our headquarters also watched Army Group B's sector with growing alarm. The enemy was capable, while ensuring that he was covered in the direction of Kharkov, of moving down on Pavlograd with the forces reported to be advancing westwards from Izium. From Pavlograd, he could go on to the Dnieper crossings of Dnepropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, thereby severing the Army Group's communications across the river. He could, moreover, try to overrun Army Detachment Lance, which was still in the process of assembling. If he succeeded, his way across the Dnieper would be open on both sides of Kremenchug, and he would subsequently be able to block the approaches to the Crimea and the Dnieper crossing at Kherson. The result would be the encirclement of the entire German southern wing. Even if the onset of the muddy season, which usually came about the end of March, were to interrupt such a far-reaching operation, the enemy could still be expected to continue pursuing this objective once it was over. In the light of these reflections, I sent OKH a fresh appreciation of the situation on 12th of February for submission to Hitler. Basing myself on the operational considerations outlined above, I laid special emphasis on 2 points. First, the ratio of forces. I pointed out that although the enemy had quite obviously been trying for almost 3 months past to precipitate matters on the Eastern Front by either demolishing or isolating our southern wing, the distribution of forces on our own side still took not the least account of this fact. Even if one allowed for the large number of divisions which had been sent to Don Army Group in recent months, the ratio of German to Soviet forces here and in Army Group B was still at least 1.8, whereas in the case of Central and Northern Army Groups it stood at 1.4. Now it was quite understandable that OKH should hesitate to create new crisis spots by taking forces away from these 2 army groups. Furthermore, OKH had probably been quite right when it pointed out, in reply to previous representations from me on the subject, that almost the whole of the available replacements of troops and weapons were being sent to Don Army Group, as a result of which the fighting potential of Central and Northern Army Groups was lower than our own. To all this, however, we could retort that the divisions of Don Army Group had been involved in incessant and very heavy fighting for months on end, which was not so in the case of the 2 army groups in the north. Besides, our divisions were fighting in open country, while Central and Northern Army Groups were established in timbered dugouts. The crucial factor, in any case, was that the enemy's decisive effort was directed not against the central or northern sectors of the German armies, but against their southern wing, and that it was inadmissible that we should continue to be left at such a numerical disadvantage. It could be taken for granted that even if we succeeded in averting the danger of being cut off from the Dnieper crossings, the enemy would still not lose sight of his more far-reaching aim of destroying the southern wing by surrounding it on the sea coast. For this reason, there must at all costs be a radical improvement in the ratio of forces on the German southern wing, even if it involved making concessions on other parts of the front or in other theatres of war. In addition to ventilating this fundamental question of the overall distribution of forces, I also stated my views to OKH on the subsequent conduct of operations on the German southern wing. This will be dealt with in the chapter on Operation Citadel. During the night of 12th of February, the Army Group, which had meanwhile been renamed Southern Army Group, moved its headquarters to Zaporozhye with a view to having the best possible control of the battle at what would shortly become the decisive spot. On the night of 13th of February, a directive was received from OKH, which was obviously the sequel to my proposals of 9th of February. It ruled, in accordance with these proposals, that a new army should deploy on the line Poltava-Dnepropetrovsk and another behind the southern wing of Second Army. In the event, however, neither army was ever formed. The one which was due to deploy behind Second Army did not arrive at all. While Second Army did receive a few reinforcements, they were given to it at the cost of those promised to ourselves. The army which was to deploy on the line Poltava-Dnepropetrovsk was Army Detachment Lance, already committed at Kharkov. It was subsequently placed under the command of Southern Army Group, together with the sector of Army Group B, inclusive of Belgorod. Second Army went over to Central Army Group, and HQ, Army Group B, was finally withdrawn from the Eastern Front order of battle. And so, around the middle of February 1943, the acute crisis in the area of Southern Army Group reached a new climax. With it, the danger that the entire southern wing of armies would be encircled by an extensive flanking movement from the neighbouring sector in the north threatened to take shape sooner or later. And yet, paradoxically, it was in this very culmination of the crisis that the germs of a counterstroke lay. Initially, however, the picture became gloomier still. It was undoubtedly a hazardous step to withdraw Army Group B at this particular moment from command at the cleft in the front. Although, apart from Second Army, it now had nothing but the battered remains of various units at its disposal, it still constituted an essential link in the chain of command on the Eastern Front. Its removal was bound to cause the front to burst open at the seam between Central and Southern Army groups. In point of fact, moreover, HQ Southern Army Group could not yet assume command of the Kharkov sector now apportioned to it, i.e. that held by Army Detachment Lands, as no signal links had been established. Before we could take over, Kharkov was due to be lost. The fact that the takeover could take place as quickly as it did was due to the consistently high performance of the Army Group Signals Regiment and the purposeful way in which our Chief Signals Officer, General Müller, handled our communications. As usual, we got liberal assistance from my friend General Feldgiebel, the Chief of the Corps of Signals. But although the removal of HQ Army Group B complicated the handling of operations at the most delicate spot on the Eastern Front, it still served one useful purpose. By bringing Army Detachment Lance under Southern Army Group, it enabled our headquarters to exercise exclusive command at the decisive place and the decisive time. In effect, this contributed substantially to the final success of the winter campaign of 1942-3. Meanwhile, the Kharkov area was to become a fresh source of anxiety for the Army Group, even if Army Group B, or rather Hitler, by dint of his personal interventions, remained in command there for a few days yet. Army Detachment Lance had been ordered by Hitler to hold Kharkov at all costs, which now threatened to become a prestige issue like Stalingrad before it. With the object of relieving the pressure on Southern Army Group's left flank, moreover, the Army Detachment was to thrust in the direction of WWII with the SS Panzer Corps as its nucleus. Of the latter's 3 armoured divisions, there were still only 2 to hand. Clearly, the Army Detachment could fulfill only one of these 2 tasks with the forces at its command. It could either fight around Kharkov or else lend a hand on the left wing of Southern Army Group. I, therefore, suggested to Hitler that Army Detachment Lance should forego Kharkov for the time being and try instead to beat the enemy south of the city. By this means, the danger of the army groups being enveloped across the Dnieper on both sides of Kremenchug would be temporarily eliminated. On the other hand, it was reasonable to suppose that by throwing in 4th Panzer Army, we could cope on our own with the enemy making for the Dnieper crossings at Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk. Once Lance had dealt with the enemy south of Kharkov, he could turn his attention to recapturing the city. This solution, however, did not suit Hitler, for whom Kharkov, as the 4th biggest city in the Soviet Union, had already become a symbol of prestige, and on 13th February he again passed a strict order to Army Detachment Lance through Army Group B to hold Kharkov at all costs. Thereupon I demanded to be informed by OKH whether this order would remain in force after Lance had come under my own command, and whether we should adhere to it even if the SS Panzer Corps were threatened with encirclement in Kharkov. I also requested an answer to the general appreciation which I had sent to Lützen the previous day. In reply, General Zeitzler told me that Hitler had described it as much too far-reaching. To this, I retorted that I considered it only right for an army group to think 4 to 8 weeks ahead, unlike the Supreme Command, which never seemed to look any further than the next 3 days. As for the situation at Kharkov, circumstances proved stronger than Hitler's will. The SS Panzer Corps, which really was in danger of being surrounded there, evacuated the city on 15th February, incidentally against the orders of General Lanz. This accomplished fact was reported to us by Army Group B, which finally relinquished its command about this time. Had the evacuation of Kharkov been ordered by a general of the army, Hitler would undoubtedly have had him court-martialed. But because this action had, quite rightly, been taken by the SS Panzer Corps, nothing of the sort occurred. All the same, the commander of Army Detachment Lanz was replaced a few days later by General Kempf on the grounds that Lanz was a mountaineer, while Kempf was a tank specialist. While the situation around Kharkov was manifestly deteriorating during the period in which Army Group B handed over the area to Southern Army Group, the possibility of the latter's being cut off from its communications across the Dnieper also became acute. It was reported on 10th of February that the enemy, as we had been expecting him to do for some time past, was advancing in strength towards Pavlograd and Dnepropetrovsk from the area west of Isium. If he succeeded in reaching Losovaya Junction or Pavlograd, or alternatively the station of Sinsinikovo hard to the southwest of Pavlograd, the railway link through Poltava would be severed. At the same time, the speed of arrival of the reinforcements promised by OKH slackened off again. Instead of the scheduled 37 troop trains per day, only 6 had come through on 14th February. Furthermore, Central Army Group announced that at present it lacked the necessary forces to make any serious attempt to cooperate with Southern Army Group along the line of cleavage between us. Apparently, it would be more than happy if it succeeded in halting Second Army, which was falling back into a concavity that already extended far west of Kursk. The situation had become so critical that Hitler decided to visit me at my headquarters. Presumably, my various comments had set him thinking. Much as I welcomed the prospect of putting my views to him personally and of letting him see the seriousness of our position for himself, it was naturally difficult to guarantee his safety in a sizable factory town like Zaporozhye, on which the enemy was advancing, particularly as he had expressed the intention of staying for some days. He and his suite, which included the Chief of the General Staff and General Jodl, and, as usual, his private cook, were accommodated in our office building, the whole vicinity of which had to be hermetically sealed off. Even then, the situation was not very reassuring, for Hitler's arrival had not passed unnoticed. As he drove into Zaporozhye from the airfield, he was recognized by soldiers and party officials in the streets. Practically the only troops we had available were our own defence company and a few anti-aircraft units, and before long enemy tanks were to get so close to the town that they could have fired at the airfield lying east of the Dnieper. Hitler arrived at my headquarters at noon on 17th of February. I began by giving him the following review of the situation. Army Detachment Hollet had reached the Mius positions that same day, closely pursued by the enemy. 1st Panzer Army had halted the enemy at Grishino, but not yet finished him off. In the Kramatorskaya area, likewise, the battle against the enemy forces which had come over the Lysychansk-Slavyansk line was still undecided. Army Detachment Lanz, having evacuated Kharkov, had withdrawn southwest towards the Mosh sector. I then went on to inform Hitler of my intention to take the SS Panzer Corps right out of Kharkov, leaving only the balance of Army Detachment Lanz in occupation. The SS Panzer Corps was to thrust southeastwards from the Krasnograd area in the general direction of Pavlograd, thereby coming into concert with 4th Panzer Army as it moved up there. The job of these forces would be to smash the enemy advancing through the broad gap between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lanz. As soon as this had been achieved and there was no further danger that Army Detachment Hollit and 1st Panzer Army would be cut off, we should proceed to attack in the Kharkov area.